Concerns of an expanding conflict in the Middle East as tensions rise.
There have been attacks and assassinations in the Red Sea, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq.
Israel says its war on Hamas will take months, but there are big disagreements about what comes next when the fighting ends.
Maintaining the control of Gaza is not an Israeli priority or necessity. I think that it's quite the same. You won't find many Israelis that are enthused about going back to ruling Gaza. I think everybody understands what price this will cast.
And U.S. aid for Ukraine hangs in the balance as Russia escalates attacks with bombardments in urban areas. Join us on The Voice of America as we explore the issues in the news. Hi, everyone. I'm Lori London in Washington. America's top diplomat is heading back to the Middle East amid fears the Israel-Hamas war could spiral into a bigger regional conflict. Associated Press Washington correspondent Sagar Megani begins our coverage.
Immediately after the war began, the Biden administration was relieved about what seemed to be the low potential for a broader Mideast battle. Since then, there have been attacks and assassinations in the Red Sea, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken leaves this weekend for a fourth Mideast visit since the war began 2.5 months ago, with stops from Israel, the West Bank, Turkey, and other nations.
We don't expect every conversation on this trip to be easy.
Spokesman Matthew Miller says the region's facing both tough issues and choices as the U.S. seeks to avoid a bigger war. Sagar Megani at the White House.
Israel is on high alert as Hamas leaders vowed revenge following the killing of Saleh Arori, one of its most senior officials in an apparent Israeli drone strike in Beirut, Lebanon this week. Israel has not commented on the attack. I spoke with Raphael Cohen, director of the Strategy and Doctrine Program at the Rand Corporation, about concerns that Arori's death could lead to broader regional conflict as tensions soar in the Middle East.
We know that Netanyahu has directed all the elements of the Israeli security establishment to hunt down Hamas wherever they are, including outside the boundaries of Gaza. We know that, at least from the media accounts, a senior Hamas official, who's the deputy head of the political arm, but has in the past had ties to the military arm as well, has been killed. And so we can assume this clearly fits with Israel's intent. I think that's in keeping with what we would expect Israeli actions to look like.
If Israel is behind the attack, could it mark a major escalation in the Middle East conflict?
I think for context, there already has been significant fighting along the Lebanon border. Much of that has been contained to the border region. So ever since October 8th, really, there's been this sort of tit-for-tat violence of Hezbollah firing rockets into northern Israel, Israel responding with airstrikes, artillery fire, and the like. For the most part, it's been contained to that border region. It hasn't spilled into Beirut proper. But even before this, there was a concern, if you talk to Israelis, that border would grow increasingly hot. Israel currently has about 100,000 plus inhabitants of the northern border, that is, northern border communities that have been evacuated. Hezbollah has done the same on their side. At least Israel alleges that Hezbollah is not complying with UN Security Council Resolution 1701. And Israeli officials have already said publicly that status quo of this sort of tit-for-tat violence and the subsequent withdrawal from those northern settlements is unsustainable. And if pushed, they would take military action. So that's a long way of saying that there was already, before this strike, a good chance that that Lebanon border would grow increasingly intense. This is one step in that direction in that regard.
Hezbollah's leader vowing to retaliate against any Israeli targeting of Palestinian officials in Lebanon. Does this mean we're entering into a more dangerous phase?
Could this mark a turning point? It's possible, but it's also, I think, important to realize that there's been tacit deterrence by both sides along the northern border with Israel, partly as a legacy to the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war. And I think from Hezbollah's perspective, they would rather that Beirut not look like Gaza does currently. And that doesn't mean that they don't seem forced to act in some way, and there probably will be some retaliation. But you can argue that there is still some element of deterrence that exists up north.
Speaking of Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed militants, the Houthi rebels, also backed by Iran, they've been firing long-range missiles at Israel and attacking civilian cargo ships in the Red Sea. That has created all kinds of concerns and issues, underscoring the concerns about the fighting widening and also, of course, soaring tensions on this key shipping route. Is that being deterred in some way, or could this escalate that as well?
So I don't think this strike would escalate that per se. I think that we have a broader problem of our inability right now to deter Houthi attacks. I mean, the we function here is, I think, important because I think from both the Israeli perspective, but also from the American perspective, the Houthi problem is viewed as mostly an American problem and an international problem as an Israeli problem, per se. And I think the response to deterring the Houthis is going to come largely from U.S. military presence in the Gulf, along with our international partners, so the Brits, the French, and the other European powers that have contributed forces to trying to deter the Houthi attacks. But yes, there's certainly a significant problem there, and that will need to be dealt with.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that this is going to take months and months. It's not going to be a quick fix to eradicate the threat of Hamas to Israel's security. And up until now, Hamas negotiators have said, we will not release any hostages until there is a condition of a final ceasefire. There are some reports that now negotiators have waived the condition of a final ceasefire and the withdrawal of IDF soldiers from Gaza. Are you hearing anything about these so-called talks? What do you think that the possibility of that would be? Because obviously the international community is calling for a ceasefire, but Israel is not going to stop until it finishes what it set out to do.
I've seen the media accounts. You see a lot of these reports, particularly in the Israeli press. And the contours of the deal usually revolve around sort of 40 or so hostages for some number of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel and some temporary cessation of hostilities. It's notable that Hamas's position has seemingly softened a little, as you noted. Originally, it came in very hard, saying there will be no negotiations for the hostages until the war is concluded. Hamas is seemingly, at least according to Israeli media accounts, backed off of that demand, which is obviously a good thing. I think there's a possibility that you can get some sort of a deal. I think from the Israeli perspective, Netanyahu is under pressure, particularly from the families of the hostages, to release more. Hamas, by contrast, I think is under significant military pressure. So some sort of cessation of hostilities, even if it's for a couple of weeks, will give them a little bit of breathing space. And it also gives them a little bit of a win if they can release Palestinian prisoners in the same boat. So there's an opportunity for some sort of deal here, but nothing's final until it's final.
And would this killing of this senior Hamas official in Lebanon change their mind about even having any negotiation, or would they still continue forward?
Yeah, so in public, my guess is this is going to throw a wrench in that, at least for the short term. Over the long term, you can see this cutting both ways. On the one hand, Hamas leadership is not particularly happy with one of their own getting killed. On the other hand, the same Hamas leaders might also view it as they are next. So you can imagine a scenario where they have more of an incentive to cut some sort of deal, if only to save their own necks. So, I think in the short run, I think the possibility of inking some sort of deal is unlikely. Over the longer term, I'm less sure.
Raphael Cohen, director of the Strategy and Doctrine Program with the Rand Corporation. Israel's army recently announced it will take several thousand troops out of Gaza in the coming weeks as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to press ahead in a war that he said will continue for months. Nimrod Goren, senior fellow of Israeli affairs at the Middle East Institute, joins us for analysis on where the war is headed and what the troop withdrawal could indicate.
It seems like we are de facto moving into a different phase of the war. So while the war will indeed continue in the coming months, the modus of operation of the IDF is changing on the ground, partly because of military achievements that have been already done. So the sustained control of the IDF over the northern part of the Gaza Strip basically means that less fighting is happening in that part, and the type of fighting that is happening in the other part of the Gaza Strip is a different one. It's more precise, more focused, and can be done in and out. So I think overall Israel is working to sustain currently the military presence in the north for the the duration of the war, to do these actions in the center and the south that are more focused, and to create some sort of a buffer along the border to help create a condition that will enable Israelis to return back to their homes that are currently evacuated.
Israel has said from the beginning, following the October 7th massacre, that its objective is to ultimately ensure that Hamas is absolutely no longer a security threat, and also potentially secure the release of the hostages that Hamas has been holding. Mm-hmm. What would it take for them to ensure that Hamas no longer is a security threat, given its expanse and its support from outside of the Palestinian territory, including Iran?
It partly relates to a third objective, which was to ensure that Hamas is no longer controlling, governing Gaza, which I think is a vital aspect here, and one that Israel's international allies in the West are supportive of. We hear about negotiations going on between the US and the Palestinians and Egypt about creating this modality of different leadership governing Gaza, de facto, once the war changes its phases. And I think from the Israeli point of view, the fact that Hamas is no longer governing Gaza will be an important step to enhance the security of the people that are living in the outskirts of Gaza. So it goes kind of together. While the total elimination of Hamas as an organization is difficult to foresee, the damage to its military capability is already happening and is likely to continue. But the key issue is who is actually in control of Gaza, and there's quite a bit of unclarity there, partly because of domestic politics in Israel and positions that Prime Minister Netanyahu is currently holding that are not in line with American aspirations, with the aspirations of many others in the Israeli political system.
What do, in general, most Israelis want to see happening here?
First is a time of change in Israeli public opinion, because for many Israelis, what happened on October 7th, before, during, and after, really shattered a lot of concepts that were long-standing in how to relate to the Palestinian issue and the importance of dealing with it and the separation between Gaza and the West Bank. So a lot of question marks have emerged. There are still not enough answers on that. I think the Israeli society is very much into the processing of what happened on October 7th and still in the minds of the war and making sure hostages are released and soldiers come back home safely. So there's not a lot of clarity about the end game in the public. But eventually the ones that are supposed to shape are not necessarily the public, is the political leadership and the state mechanisms. And what we see is a reluctance by the Prime Minister to push forward a debate within the government and the cabinet on the day after, because there are different positions. There are some on the Israeli right that would like to see continued control, and Netanyahu may want to see all kind of arrangements on the ground that enable Gaza to be managed without Palestinian Authority control. And many, I think, in Israel want to see eventually a credible, legitimate, moderate Palestinian leadership coming from the West Bank, from Ramallah, returning to govern Gaza, eventually paving a way to a renewed negotiation process after this all ends. So there are different options currently on the table, and the way Israeli politics is being played out, and there may be political changes coming up during the coming year, will also impact which of these scenarios will be advanced and which will not.
When it's all over, if Israel continues to want full control over the Gaza Strip, will that further escalate tensions with its neighbors?
I think it's not in Israel's interest to reoccupy Gaza and stay there. After all, Israel decided at the time, and it was a Likud right-wing prime minister who decided to withdraw from Gaza, that maintaining the control of Gaza is not an Israeli priority or necessity. I think that quite the same. You won't find many Israelis that are enthused about going back to ruling Gaza. I think everybody understands what price this will cast. Yes, people are concerned about security and how the war ends in a situation in which the sense of security of Israelis living in the south is being restored. But on the long term, people are looking for other solutions, and definitely there is a lot of value attached to maintaining the good relations with our Arab neighbors, those countries that have peace treaties with Israel, especially Egypt and Jordan on our borders, with whom there's quite a bit of tensions because of the war and a lot of criticism by them on Israeli actions, but a lot of resilience proven to the relationship that are continuing. And Egypt is playing a very important role in the mediation efforts to release the hostages and discussions about the day after. And when you look to the border region, those Arab countries with which Israel has normalization agreements are too playing a constructive role. So they are not condemning Hamas publicly as Israel would have liked them to do, but they are still sticking to their relationship with Israel in a different scope at the moment, but are playing a constructive role in what's happening in Gaza in the day after. Specifically, we can see the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and the humanitarian aid that they are pouring into the Gaza Strip becoming a significant actor in an area which they didn't play a significant role before.
Nimrod Goren, Senior Fellow of Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute.
Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar!
Hundreds of Hamas militants were killed or captured during their October 7th rampage into Israel, in which they killed some 1,200 people and kidnapped about 240, sparking the war in Gaza. As Linda Gradstein reports for VOA from Jerusalem, Israeli officials say many of the Hamas fighters were carrying Captagon, amphetamine pills that can lower inhibitions and radically boost stamina.
Numerous witnesses said that many of the Hamas militants who crossed the border from Gaza into Israel on October 7th appeared euphoric. They managed to invade more than 20 small communities, slaying about 1,200 Israelis, and in some cases mutilating and raping them, and taking 240 others hostage. Israeli officials confirmed that many of the gunmen who were captured or killed were carrying pills containing Captagon, an amphetamine drug nicknamed poor man's cocaine and ISIS chemical courage.
For years, Captagon has been prevalent among Islamic State fighters, especially in Iraq and Syria, basically because it gives them almost superhuman powers, including the ability to stay awake, calm, focus for days. I would also add that Captagon also, to some extent, eliminates fear and hunger, and its low cost, which is estimated between $1 and $5, can also explain its large consumption among youth in the Middle East.
Many Israeli drug experts believe that Captagon was widely used during the Hamas invasion in October, and while officials say pills were found on the attackers, the Israeli army spokesman has not confirmed whether Hamas militants captured alive had admitted using Captagon, or if any had been found in the bloodstream of those killed.
We know that Captagon was found. We know that it was found in large quantities, and we can assume from that it was used extensively by Hamas terrorists to reduce moral judgment, to enhance combat activity, to enhance sexual excitation, to reduce any kind of inhibition towards conducting atrocities.
But some Israeli analysts caution that Captagon cannot be blamed for the Hamas atrocities of October 7th. They say responsibility for the brutality comes from many years of indoctrination and the dehumanizing of Jews.
Amphetamines do not turn people into savages. Okay? The same way that the youngsters that take amphetamines and dance all night and party don't become savage, the terrorists don't become savages because of amphetamine.
Captagon use by militant groups is not only problematic in the context of the Hamas attack against Israel, it is an extremely lucrative commodity which is mainly manufactured in Syria and exported to Middle Eastern Arab countries, many of which have declared the drug's use a national public health emergency. Linda Gradstein for VOA News, Jerusalem.
You're listening to Issues in the News. I'm Lori London.
We have given now Ukraine the last security assistance package that we have funds to support right before New Year's, right after Christmas. And we've got to get support from Congress so we can continue to do that.
As Russia's war on Ukraine approaches its 2-year mark, continued American military aid remains in limbo. Following a trip to the U.S.-Mexican border this week with a group of his fellow congressional Republicans, U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson dug in on demands for hardline immigration policies in exchange for backing President Biden's emergency wartime funding request for Ukraine.
If President Biden wants a supplemental spending bill focused on national security, it better begin by defending America's national security.
In response, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre described the trip as a political stunt and said Johnson has shown little interest in finding solutions at the border.
You have Speaker Johnson, who has been very clear where he stands on the border, right? Who has continues with the House Republicans to make this a political issue and to move forward with political stunts, and has blocked any efforts for the president to deal with the border.
As future U.S. military aid remains uncertain, Russia has stepped up its attacks on Ukraine, a barrage of strikes targeting the capital of Kyiv and the northeastern city of Kharkiv this week, followed bombardments last week, including what Ukrainian officials described as Russia's largest single-day assault since the start of the war in February 2022. I spoke with Karolina, Russia deputy team lead with the Institute for the Study of War war for insights into what the escalating attacks may indicate and the implications for Ukraine to defend itself going forward, potentially without U.S. military aid.
There's a couple things to think about when we're thinking about the apparent escalation and especially the size and the types of weapons that Russia used in the December 29th attack and then in the subsequent January 2nd attack. Over the past several months, these sort of small-scale, mostly Shahed drone-based strikes have been pretty prevalent across Ukraine. On a nearly daily basis, we've seen Russian forces launch some amount of these Iranian-provided Shahed drones, but they don't really seem to be trying to hit Ukrainian targets, right? So it really seemed as though they were using these Shahed drones to probe Ukrainian air defenses and figure out what the best strike routes were. And what we saw on December 29th and then again on January 2nd was essentially the effect of months of basically experimentation and adaptation to Ukrainian air defenses, in that we saw these massive strike series that combined a smaller number of Shahed drones and then several different types of missiles, from Kinzhals to Calibers to ballistic missiles such as Iskanders and S-300s, being applied in a way that was actually quite effective and very much overcame and circumvented elements of Ukrainian air defense and was able to hit critical civilian infrastructure as well as military infrastructure. And we've always assessed this escalation and that Russia uses these strike campaigns in an attempt to break Ukrainian will. And break Ukrainian will in a couple of ways. Of course, there are the psychological impacts of living in fear of these mass strikes that sometimes hit civilian buildings, residential areas, etc. But then there's also this aspect of, we know that a lot of the strikes, especially on the 29th, were targeted at Ukrainian defense industrial base complexes, areas, etc. And that's really meant to continue to discourage Western support and Western investment in the Ukrainian defense industrial base and make it kind of this risk balance calculus for the West and its continued provision of aid for Ukraine. So generally, the escalation is psychological and meant to really try to break Ukrainian will. And it's ultimately this culmination of months and months of testing and adaptation and experimentation that Russians have been doing against Ukrainian air defenses.
Of course, launched attacks on Russia's border in Belgorod, the biggest Russian city near the border. What do you think Ukraine's strategy was behind that?
Right. There's always kind of the idea that Ukraine wants to posture its own strike capabilities. We've seen continued Ukrainian strikes against Black Sea fleet assets in Crimea and the Black Sea, which have actually greatly degraded Russia's capacity to maintain control of the Black Sea. So we've seen these retaliatory strikes on the part of Ukraine, which have been very clear answers to these sorts of Russian strikes, and also just posturing Ukraine's ability to continue to defend itself and strike into Russia, which of course has psychological effects within Russia itself.
And of course, Congress is yet to approve any further military aid for Ukraine. How important is that U.S. aid for Ukraine, and can Ukraine continue to fight off Russia's invasion without it?
Yeah, so Western aid truly remains vital for Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russian strikes, especially strike series as massive as those of the past few days. And the end of Western aid, specifically in Western air defense aid, would likely set conditions for an expanded and very devastating Russian air campaign in Ukraine. Ukrainian air defenses have been very much bolstered by Western-provided systems and missiles, and we see that when these Western-provided systems are used, they're actually used to great effect. For example, Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Zaluzhny noted that there was a record number of Kinzhal missiles shot down on January 2nd using Patriot systems. So Patriot systems shot down 10 of the 10 launched Kinzhal missiles. So this is how we really see how vital these systems are in helping Ukraine defend its own territories. As this aid runs out, and if Western air defense provisions end, Ukraine is going to have to make a decision of pulling its air defense systems closer to critical population centers and away from the front line, which of course will impact its ability to cover critical frontline areas, and that will impact ground operations in critical areas frontline. And of course, the idea that without Western air defense provision, Russia will be able to expand its air campaign much closer to NATO's borders. It's also a very dangerous idea. So ultimately, Western aid is the vital component in Ukraine's ability to repel against these attacks.
That was Karolina Hurd, Russia Deputy Team Lead with the Institute for the Study of War. And that's all the time we have this week. week. On behalf of all of us here at VOA, thank you for listening.